All right, it looks like we're live now for our second philosophy pop-up, second in this month, and second overall as well. And I polled my Patreon supporters about what they wanted me to talk about. Martin Heidegger won over Stoicism. Aristotle was a distant third. So this month we're talking about some topics in Heidegger. I actually have some stuff that I was been thinking about that I planned, but then I'll just open it up to any sort of questions or comments. They can be about Heidegger, they can be about philosophy in general, they can be about other stuff. So yeah, I think that's probably enough said about that. So Heidegger is one of those thinkers who, you know, like many of the other people that I work on and incorporate and shoot videos on and sometimes even do classes on, I think there's some really valuable stuff in his work, and then I disagree with him on some other things. So I'm not a Heideggerian any more than I'm a Hegelian, even though I do the Hour Hegel series, but I do think that Heidegger is somebody who's really important to spend some time studying. I can't say that I ever went through a Heideggerian phase, and I think that part of the reason for that was because when I was in graduate school, I mean, first of all, I really only encountered Heidegger in graduate school. We had to read him a little bit as an undergrad because existentialism was really big where I went to undergraduate, which no longer has a philosophy program, by the way. So I read some Heidegger. I can't say I understood anything other than this idea of being towards death, which, and that anxiety was very important. But then when I got to grad school, there were actually quite a few other grad students who really thought that Heidegger was the guy or the philosopher to study. I would say that, so the Southern Illinois University Carbondale graduate department in philosophy was what we call a pluralistic department. There were representatives of continental philosophy, analytic philosophy, and classical American, and even some history of philosophy people. So Heidegger was really one of the big thinkers, I would say, in the continental side, just as big as, say, Dewey was in the American side. And I'm trying to think of, they were into Lewis and Chisholm and people like that on the analytic side, Dennett as well. And then, I started reading Heidegger. And so anyway, there were these people that were sort of convinced Heideggerians, and I didn't really like them. When you get into these long discussions that go over, semesters with the same people, you get to know a lot about, not just the philosopher that you're supposed to be talking about and reading, but maybe also about what other people think are really the most important themes. And, I was very into philosophy of language. So people were like, well, you've got to read Heidegger because, language is the house of being. And, on my own, I did find a lot of profound insights into language in Heidegger and its connections with other things, but I wasn't getting it from the Heideggerians. So I never really became a Heideggerian of any sort. Now, what I wanted to talk about, I was thinking about this morning. I get a lot of YouTube questions, and sometimes occasionally, people emailing me or messaging me in other social media like Facebook or Twitter. And a lot of these questions turn on, the issue of, well, what should I be reading in philosophy? And often it's not just asking for sort of a menu list, well, read these guys and do it in this order or something like that. There's a worry behind it that somehow somebody is going to miss out on what's most essential in philosophy. And this is a really interesting issue, and I think I'll probably do a video about this when I can find the time later on. You can get yourself, a history of philosophy like, Cobblestone's. I mean, if you want a good, reliable one, you pick something like that, or a more recent one. Or you can get some, fairly idiosyncratic history of philosophy, which, sort of selects in different ways. And you're getting a listing of who is important to engage in. And you're probably going to miss some people in there who might have been interesting to read, that you might only come across if you're, digging through the stacks in the library or following up on some footnotes and somebody else. Like, for example, somebody who I really like is this guy, and I'll actually write his name down on the side. He's not read by a lot of people, but his name is Lev Shestov. He was a ethnically Jewish Russian philosopher who wound up being transplanted to France. He had to flee after the Russian Revolution, and his works are very interesting. But how would you come across him? There's a couple different ways, but most people don't know much about him. He is mentioned, by the way, in Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. I always get that mixed up. Sisyphus. Anyway. He's mentioned as one of the existentialists, so you might follow up on that. Now, how would you find out who you should actually study? Well, the best that you can go by is some sort of recommendations by somebody else, or doing your own digging around and, maybe following things out yourself. We're always operating in the conditions, so here's where we get back to Heidegger, of what Heidegger talked about as finitude. We are not, and we can never really place ourselves, we can imagine ourselves, we can never really place ourselves in a kind of God's eye position. We're always operating on the basis of insufficient information, sometimes more, sometimes less. And this applies to, when we engage in what's essentially practical decision-making about where we ought to put our time and thought and attention, like when we're deciding what to study in philosophy. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to get recommendations and then to, read those things, and then maybe get some more recommendations and, do some reflection and revision of what their plans are. And just to keep, plowing away at it. So if I tell you, well, I think you should start with Plato, but somebody else tells you, no, you have to read all the pre-Socratics, what we have of them first. You could pick either path, and that's okay. And somebody else might tell you, well, just get yourself a good secondary history of philosophy before tackling the first stuff, or get yourself a nice introductory text. And I would say, no, read the primary text. And you can get into philosophy any of those ways, but I think a lot of people get very anxious about getting into philosophy and whether they're going to do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And here's the thing. You can't possibly, in your lifetime, read all the philosophical works that are out there. You can't even read all of the, great thinkers in a really attentive, adequate way in your lifetime, particularly if you have to work for a living, like all of the people that I know do. I don't know anybody who's independently wealthy at this point. And so, you're operating in conditions of finitude. And think about this too, you don't want to spend all of your available time just reading and reflecting on philosophy. I mean, that's kind of nice, but you also do want to live a life so that philosophy connects up with other things too. And you want to meet other people and talk with them about this. So we're always sort of doing our best in these conditions of finitude. And you can say similar things about studying other things, or about how you learn from experience and gradually improve the relationships that you have with the people in your life, some of whom are dying, some of whom are disappearing, some of whom are moving on and changing in various ways. You can say this about the talents that you develop, I don't know, for art or music, or your body and its athleticism, what there is of that. We work with what we have. And I think this is. I'll just say this, and then I'll start answering some questions or taking comments. And use the chat thing by all means to ask whatever you'd like. So I gave you kind of something that's kind of bad news, right? Well, you can never really take it all in. You can conceive of somebody doing that, but that's purely imaginary. It's not really possible for us. And the more that you do philosophy, the more you discover this to be the case. But there is good news too. And the good news comes in two ways, I think. One is that it can be liberating to find out that you don't have to do it all, that you can't do it all, so you don't have to do it all. I think there's a lot of people who think that unless they are taking in the totality of philosophical thought, they're somehow, I don't know, letting philosophy down or letting themselves down or something along those lines. And that doesn't have to be the case. As a matter of fact, it's an unrealistic demand to place upon yourself. The other thing is, even though we can't read everybody and compare all of them to each other and reflect on them and critically analyze all of them, and we can only really do just a portion, and we forget half of what we've read anyway, if you're like me, we can still get to the heart of things. It's still possible for us to get at what's essential. That's what's amazing about this. I mean, think back to ancient times, and imagine that you are a monk in a monastery, and that's one. In the West, of course, this is one of the places where learning has been preserved from all those disorders and tumults and waves of people invading and culture essentially getting lost. And you've got a library. And in your library, you might have Plato's Timaeus, maybe. And you probably have Aristotle's Categories and Boethius's commentary on it, and maybe a few other things. And you might have some Seneca, and you might have some Cicero. And you definitely have a few, very important and interesting Christian authors like Augustine and John Cassian, and you've got a few other things to read here and there. Maybe somebody even wrote something at your monastery that's worth reading. Now, could you get to the heart of the matter of human existence on that basis and applying your own thought? And think about the big questions. Yes, you can. I mean, you might not have the same sort of thoughts that you would have if you were able to encounter people who are coming centuries after you in time, which would include, by the way, other people in that situation, like say Saint Anselm, right, or the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, or Kant, or Heidegger, or Hegel, or any of those people. But you can still think what is really essential. And we're in a similar situation today. In our case, the issue is not that we don't have enough books. The issue is that we have an embarrassment of riches that we can't possibly digest and get through and even curate all that well, because there's just so much out there. But the good news is so much of it is great stuff that if we grapple with, we can get something out of it. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat window here, so I am going to check stuff on social media and see, because I know somebody asked a question in Facebook, and see if I can't maybe also get the questions coming through in the other format. In YouTube, in part because this is my first time playing around with YouTube Live in a very long time. All right, so Belal Khanfar asked on Facebook, and I'll just put this in the chat window so everybody else can see it. Do I think there's a philosopher that speaks to us and can teach us more than other philosophers in this present moment? So that's a great question. Is there a philosopher? No, I don't think so. Are there philosophers, plural? Definitely yes. And I mean, what I'm going to say really reflects the kind of people that I'm reading and engaging with. So let's start by talking about people who are actually still on the scene and doing work now. I would say one of the people who I particularly like in that respect is Alasdair MacIntyre. I'm a big fan of his. He's still producing new work, which I think is quite admirable. He's in his 80s, very, very sharp mind, a guy who I've been fortunate enough to get to know a little bit, and who I know is the real deal when it comes to virtue ethics, and who is very practically oriented. So yeah, somebody who I don't know, who I think is quite interesting, and whose works I get a lot out of, although I often disagree with him, is Jürgen Habermas. I also like, and I haven't read enough of him to really have a great, you could say great overview picture, is Giorgio Agamben. But I think that the stuff that I've read is very interesting and very timely. I really enjoy, reading Julia Annis, or it might be Annis. Should know since I've met her at Stoicon. That was sort of like getting to meet a rock star. I think that a lot of the stuff that she does in terms of ancient philosophy is incredibly relevant to our own time. And so, I mean, we could pick other people. When we talk about who else is particularly relevant, I think that, so a lot of people take Heidegger as somebody who really one ought to start with. My wife is a PhD candidate with European Graduate School, which is this really cool sort of high-intensity, low-residency graduate program, originally started by Derrida and some other people based in Switzerland and Malta, and they've got some outreach in New York. And they really, they're mostly focused on continental stuff, of course. And they treat Heidegger almost sort of like preliminary reading, sort of like a lot of programs might say, all right, we need to start with some Plato and some Aristotle. I think they take Heidegger that way. Who else in the 20th century would I say is really, really important in that way and has a lot to teach us? I hesitate to recommend him because he decided to write in such an obscure manner in his écrits, which I think is a bad decision on his part. I understand why he did it, but I'll say I'll invoke him anyway. Jacques Lacan, I think, is really worth engaging with, but I suggest instead of reading the écrits first, engaging with some of the seminars, which are much more readable. When it comes to some of the issues going on in our own time in terms of gender relations and stuff like that, it's interesting to go to somebody like say de Beauvoir, who by the way does a great job in completing the ethics that Sartre was never able to get around to doing in her Ethics of Ambiguity. But I'm a big fan, I think, as a lot of people know, of somebody who's much earlier, but whose thought I think is very relevant in our time, and that is Mary Wollstonecraft. Somebody else who I think is particularly worth spending time with and thinking in terms of where we are in our historical situation is Hannah Arendt. And of course, in order to, if you read some of these people, I think that one of the things that'll come out of it is they're going to make you want to read other people. So if you read Arendt and you don't want to go back and read more Plato and Aristotle and Augustine, or read some Nietzsche or some other thinkers, you're probably not reading Arendt right. Same thing with reading McIntyre or Julianus or any of these people. That's actually sort of a virtue in philosophy, I suppose, for philosophical authors, that they get you to not just read them, but want to go back and reread other people, that they're part of a vast conversation. And I think that's kind of a different model of philosophy than we often see in analytic or even in much continental philosophy. This notion of philosophy as being a genuine, ongoing critical conversation, as opposed to, just much more circumscribed discourses. So I see we have about 85 people watching. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm not seeing any in the chat, so let me go over to the YouTube interface and see if I see anything posted in there. Remember, I think you can use your chat. All right, so here we go. Here's the live chat. I'm not sure why I'm not actually seeing it here, but there is a ton of stuff. All right, so I need to look in this portion. All right, reading back up. A lot of hellos and greetings from people. I'm going to start just taking things as I see them here. So I apologize for not answering these questions earlier. Now I see how to do it in this thing. So Paul Digert asks an important question: did Heidegger ever denounce the Nazi Party? No, he did not. And I suppose it's worth saying a little bit about the Nazi thing. Especially since since the Black Notebooks came out, that's really a major clincher, so my view is that we can dissociate a lot of ideas from Heidegger's philosophy from his Nazism. There's some ideas that I think that probably feed into it. I mean, the fact that he was able to view Hitler as sort of this, whatever we want to call it, something of being on the scene, that's very troubling, right? But that's not something that's, I think, intrinsic to all of his philosophy. So, all right. Zania Gerloff says, did you read the English translation? I bet he's a very interesting. Oh, she's responding, I think, to Chinu Ashrae's very interesting philosopher to translate. Heidegger is difficult to translate. When I was taking my Heidegger seminar in graduate school, I was reading him in class in the German, and then I would compare sometimes with the available translations, Mockery's translation, and then this more recent Stambau translation. Nowadays, I have to admit I'm a bit lazy. I tend to read it in translation unless I want to really look closely at a passage, or if I'm shooting a video on it, then I look at the German. MetaNomad has what they call a really specific question. Do you see any overlap between Heideggerian thought and Levinas's Ilya? Well, I mean, Levinas is definitely engaging Heidegger. I'll say a broader thing first, that there's kind of a genealogy in continental philosophy in terms of phenomenology that shows the real difference between like continental philosophy and real European philosophy. And when I say real European philosophy, I mean something that's different than the truncated version of what was going on the continent that we have here that gets taught as continental philosophy. So, you know, phenomenology gets said to begin with Husserl, but it really didn't. It's beginning with both Husserl and Shaler. It's coming out of, you know, Brentano's thought. Bergson and Blondel, before Heidegger, before Husserl is doing what he's doing, are doing things very, very similar to phenomenology. So there's a lot of people sort of working in that field at the time. And the standard genealogy goes Husserl, Heidegger, you know, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Levinas, all kind of on the same thing. Derrida, Marion, Henri, you know, and just skip everybody else. And so I want to say, there's a lot more going on in phenomenology, and all these people are reading each other and responding to each other. So yeah, there's a lot of connections between them. All right, skipping down a bit. So here's an interesting thing from Nick Weich. I think it's pronounced. It might be Weich. His question concerning technology and the modern reliance on smartphones and social media. Never mind McLuhan, it's gone much further, hasn't it? Yeah, I think that's a great point. The notion of treating things as standard reserve that you find discussed in the question concerning technology, and this sort of, you know, reduction of the scope of being to what can be, let's actually just call it, what can be given metrics, right? To use the contemporary term. I think that the question concerning technology is a great piece about that. Now, it's interesting you bring up McLuhan, because McLuhan is interested in generally McLuhan is doing compare-contrast, right? Hot and cold media. That's why I think some of his analyses are very interesting, but often are a little bit too schematic and binary. And you know, where does things like cell phones or social media fit in? Well, they're kind of image-based. They're kind of writing. You know, it's not entirely clear how we should understand them. But Heidegger is getting at how does technology and our you know, sort of obsession with it, you know, like our iPhones and things, really cut into our capacity for appreciating other kinds of being. You know, think about, for example, the food porn phenomena, right? All these people taking pictures of their food and being more interested in how many likes it gets because of the plating and all of that. And plating is important in a culinary sense, right? But really, taste is probably at the essence of food. You know? I don't know. We could say a lot more about that. So there's some really good. Barry D. Treasure asked Dr. Sadler, what do you think of Jordan Peterson? I lean conservative, but regardless of his politics, I personally think his understanding of philosophy, especially postmodernism, is embarrassing. Well, this will probably be a little embarrassing for me, but I have not read his maps of meaning. I've looked at his website in the past, and I've, you know, a lot of people have recommended him to me, so I've listened to, you know, a bit of his stuff, but I frankly don't get as much time as I'd like to stay up on other people in the field. You know, it's sort of a treat for me to get to spend time watching or listening to some of the other people who I you know, work with, like well, somebody who recently interviewed Jordan Peterson, and I'll mention him by name here, Cliff Sargent, who does the Better Than Food book reviews, which I particularly like. But even that, I don't get to check that out very often. Now, Jordan Peterson, so I can't really comment on his understanding of postmodern. I'll say this, that a lot of people are using this term postmodern in a way that to me seems kind of strange, you know, because there isn't a single postmodern, and I don't think there ever really was, even when postmodernism was a young, identifiable movement. You know, people like Lyotard and Jameson were able to identify a number of different ways in which you can understand it, and you know what's being signified by it. I actually, when it comes to, this is something I've been thinking about doing a Dr. Sadler's soapbox about, you know, the gender pronoun thing. I get where Peterson is coming from, because, you know, there's kind of a, well, what next kind of response to the, we should add all sorts of things in. I personally kind of like the, although there are some downsides to it, I kind of like the, let's just go to they. Let's use they for everybody, you know? Because yeah, that would simplify my writing so much. I use he or she typically. I don't do the, you know, typical philosopher thing of putting it all in the female gender, or switching back and forth between them. I also don't do the, you know, mankind versus humanity or stuff like that. I wish we could, you know, I kind of wish we could like dispense with that, because to me that's kind of a low level issue compared to the bigger issues that we have to grapple with. So, all right, let's see what else we've got. Oh, here's an interesting one. Pablo Camparino, my question is this: could you talk about the relationship between Wittgenstein and Heidegger? What do they have in common? Do you see them as expressions of the same movement in different sides of the discipline? So I'll say this: there are quite a few people who are attracted to that notion that Wittgenstein and Heidegger are, you know, doing similar things. Great example that would be Richard Rorty, who lines them also up with John Dewey. You know? I don't find that very convincing. I will also say this too. I mentioned Alasdair MacIntyre. In an interview that MacIntyre did with Kinesis, which is the graduate school journal from the Southern Illinois University Carbondale Department of Philosophy, MacIntyre actually said that he considered both Wittgenstein and Heidegger to be important philosophers, but important in different ways. He thought that Heidegger was important in part because he was wrong about so many things, and his erroneous perspective has had such a deleterious influence on philosophy. He thought that Wittgenstein was right, important because he was right about some things. So now, you know, Wittgenstein and Heidegger are both interested in language. They're both interested in what we could call the pragmatics of language, not just, you know, analyzing semantics. I actually put in a jibe about, you know, the recent existentialist comic post about, you know, the metaphysicians who become sort of a, you know, sort of like Captain Planet versus Wittgenstein. And I ribbed him a little bit because, you know, he said that you know, Wittgenstein was all about semantics. Wittgenstein was also about how we use language to do things. That was what was really revolutionary in Wittgenstein's attitude. The whole notion of language game and language involved with form of life, you know, all of that is coming out of there. But I think that, I mean, there are some other similarities in what they're combating, right? They're both against a kind of Cartesianism. But I don't really see that many connections between them, frankly. I think we can make connections in interesting ways between them. Sort of like we can be eclectic in philosophy and say, I can connect up some things here in Stoicism with some things in Aristotelianism and make a better synthesis. But I don't see them as intrinsically connected. Tommy L. asks, what's your view on technocracy in light of what's happening at the White House these days? Shouldn't the Attorney General of a state or a country be a professor of law, for example, and so on? Yeah, I think that's sort of that should be a minimal, well, professor of law? No, I don't think they should be a professor of law. I think that they should be a practicing jurist. But I'm not, as somebody who came from inside of the academy, it's sort of like knowing how the sausage is made. There's so much that's very contingent and really in certain ways, what's the word? Not nepotistic, not corrupt, but something along those lines in academics that I don't have much trust. When I see that somebody has that they're teaching at Harvard or their degree is from Yale or blah 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 blah, I'm not particularly impressed. What I want to actually see their work, and I want to interact with the person if possible to gauge myself whether they're just a dud or who managed to make the right contacts and go to the right school and have the right grooming. And is lucky enough to win what we call the academic lottery, or whether they're the real deal. That said, I've met some people from elite schools who have really impressed me, but I've met plenty who haven't. So I don't think that's that important to know what the hell you're doing. And so I'd rather have real practicing lawyers as Attorney General. How does this connect with technocracy? I'm not sure I see the connection there between the two. Let me take some other ones. Why is Marcuse so hard to read? This comes from Arya Ghazavi. Well, so interestingly, when it comes to critical theorists, I think that Marcuse is actually easier to read than some of the other ones, like, say, Theodor Adorno, right? Or even Jürgen Habermas. But Marcuse is hard to read. And Marcuse is hard to read, I think, in large part because there's a lot of jargon there. And this is similar to a lot of philosophers. And the question that I think we often have to ask ourselves is, well, is the jargon really necessary to convey the thought, or is it just kind of showing off? I think in the case of a lot of secondary literature and sort of, I'm inspired by this person, a lot of times the jargon is a substitute for thinking. It's working with a kind of linguistic machine that turns out interesting results. Not confined to philosophy, by the way. Historians do this, lit crit people do this, futurists do this. Pick all sorts of people. It's a common thing. Sometimes the jargon really is needed, and then you got to figure out what the code of that jargon is, and when you do, it unlocks things. I had an interesting comment on a video recently that was on one of the category videos, and the person was saying in these videos, I don't know why the hell Aristotle had to write in such a complex way. And I said, well, I'm glad the videos helped you. But the reason why Aristotle wrote in such a complex way for this work is because he's grappling with complex realities. And so the language needs to be adequate to what he's trying to grapple with. And so the person said, I try to take these passages and translate them into simpler ways of expressing it. I said, well, that's a good thing to do. But you got to watch out that you're not oversimplifying. Sometimes, to go back to this point, sometimes the terminology really does need to be there. All right, let me go back down. I think. Here we go. Philip Domini wrote, perhaps you should give us a top 20 list of works that really matter. It would be tough for me to do. I do these 10 or, I don't think I've ever done a 20. I do these lists every once in a while in videos, like I did the 10 works I would bring to a philosophical, 10 philosophical works I would bring to a desert island. I'm actually in the process of thinking out who are my 10 favorite fiction writers that I keep going back to over and over again. But 20 lists that work, a list of 20 works that really matter. That's not a bad idea. Let's see here. A lot of people are weighing in about, I like this guy, I like that guy. Here's an interesting one. From Subconscious Qualms. Thoughts of which philosophers do you think should be studied or explored more? So let's talk about this in a very commercial metaphor. Who are the undervalued stocks where putting in the time will give you a great return on investment? I mentioned Lev Shestov. I think Lev Shestov is a really great writer. He's not systematic. Even in his more seemingly systematic works, very anti-systematic, but really, really worth reading. Again, I mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft. It's a shame that she's not included, and there's other interesting women writers too who aren't included in sort of the standard history of moral thought or things like that. Her vindication of the rights of women, really worth reading. I think that if you're interested in existentialist thought, somebody else who is also worth reading, who is primarily a poet, but who has some very interesting letters, is Rainer Maria Rilke. I enjoy going back to him over and over and over again. He thought out a lot of stuff in his letters, and there's an entire metaphysics sort of underlying his poetic thought, particularly later in like the Do We Know elegies. Who else would I say people don't read that they ought to read? Actually, let me start with ancient stuff. We often start people out on so read some Plato, read some Aristotle, read some Stoics. Now read some Epicurus or maybe Lucretius, and maybe Sextus Empiricus, and boom, you're done, right? But maybe read some Plotinus as well. But who are the people that are kind of overlooked in the ancient period that I think are pretty cool? Cicero. I'm a huge fan of Cicero. I mean, if you want to get to see somebody who studied with some of the best representatives of these philosophical schools, churning them over, putting them into a different language, that's he's a great guy to read. Plutarch has biographies that people read, but he's also got some really cool Middle Platonist discussions of all sorts of topics. I'm a big fan of his. Who else? There's a lot of interesting early Christian writers who are not just, they're high-powered thinkers, and they're trying to engage in thinking ancient Greek philosophy in relation to Christian thought. Clement of Alexandria, I'm a big fan of his. I really like Lactantius. He's got a really interesting piece on divine anger. John Cassian is really worth reading. And then, we can sort of like march through the Middle Ages. If you haven't read Boethius, you definitely need to read Boethius. In the modern period, I think that somebody who we don't typically read, other than a little portion of, is Blaise Pascal, and he is really fun to read around in. That's probably enough of that. I could probably go on all day if I thought about that. All right, so now Dash asks the question that that I'm not going to be able to answer, but I think it's a cool question, so I'm gonna say it. Right? There's a passage in the Hebrew translation of After Virtue that Hebrew readers will find complacency in Maimonides' 8 chapters in relation to his book. Do you think it's adequate? I wouldn't know. I mean, I don't read Hebrew, and I couldn't say, but that's a pretty cool question. Yeah. Let's see here. Oh, here is a really challenging question by Protic B. Plob. I have a question, though it's out of the topic, that is how analytic philosophy can help us in our life or as a practiced philosophy. So I'm going to go on the record here and say that at this point in time, I don't think there is any one single thing that actually is analytic philosophy anymore. Some of my analytic trained friends have been talking for decades about being in a post-analytic situation. That is, analytic philosophy, it did at one time have sort of a common history and set of projects, and now it's become sort of like a de facto just way of doing things, and it's spun off into all these different discourses, most of which are not communicating with each other in any effective way. So you'll find the same terminology, for example, being used in analytic metaphysics, but meaning something very different, say, in other discourses like in aesthetics or philosophy of action or things like that. Can analytic philosophy really function in our lives? Yeah, I mean, the whole training in figuring out what the arguments are and representing them clearly, and then looking at whether premises are questionable or not, coming up with counterexamples. That's all good stuff. And a lot of people do that on their own without studying contemporary analytic philosophy. But I think if that studying it helps you do that, that's great. I don't know that there's that much more guidance for life, other than in particular ways. Like if you're worried about questions about animal rights and you read some analytic literature on animal rights, and that helps you figure out how to treat your pets, or whether you should have pets, that's good, I guess. So I don't have that much to say about that topic beyond that. R.J. Grandel asks, what are the main prerequisites for reading Heidegger's What is Metaphysics? Very interested in it, but I'm not so sure I'm well versed enough to get a lot out of it. So that's actually a really great question. There aren't any prerequisites. I mean, this is one of the things that I can say about many philosophical works. You don't have to satisfy prerequisites to read them. There's no philosophy police or ratifying body that's going to say, you must read this first. I mean, there's plenty of people who will do that sort of thing, and they may do it for a variety of reasons. I'll give you sort of one bad reason and then one good reason. So one bad reason is because they're caught up in the prestige of being an expert on who they're teaching or talking about, or perhaps writing their dissertation on, and they think that you can't possibly understand Derrida if you haven't read this and this and this and this, And, quite frankly, those people are jerks. There's a lot of them. And I wouldn't listen to anything that they have to say because typically they're wrong. But there is a lot of that kind of, throwing things around. And oftentimes those people that don't know about the Derrida or the Heidegger or the Plato or the whoever, right? A good reason might be, more like giving somebody counsel and saying, well, you'll get more out of your reading of X if you've already understood Y that you're heading into. The reason why I like to use Heidegger's What is Metaphysics as an introductory text for students in first grappling with Heidegger's thought is precisely because it's fairly basic. He's not going into a lot of depth on things. He does make a few references to ways of thinking and a few technical discussions about logic and the intellect and negation, but I think it's pretty accessible. And I mean, here's the other thing I want to say: when you're reading a philosophical text, expect to read it and maybe get a bit out of it, and then reread it after you've grappled with the ideas a bit and get more out of it. It's an iterative process, and then read something else, and then come back to it and get more out of it. I mean, I put this in a comment on somebody's YouTube comment earlier today, but it's something that I say over and over and over again to my students and to lifelong learners. I've been studying thinkers like, say, Descartes or Plato or Aristotle or Heidegger, many of them for more than 2 decades. Usually reading them very closely in the original language, teaching their texts to people, and either I must be a real dummy, and just not getting it, or those texts are incredibly rich, because I still keep finding more stuff in those texts. And that's kind of amazing to me, how rich these philosophical works can be, that they reward further and further reading. So I wouldn't be too worried about prerequisites. I would, just get into it, and as you read other Heidegger stuff, some of the things that are in What is Metaphysics will probably click, or you'll see additional depth to it. Reading other things may help out as well. All right, so I think I got a little bit mixed up about where the questions are. Okay, let me get back, scroll up a little bit. Boy, there's a lot of them. I think they may have multiplied in the process. A lot of discussion in here about Jordan Peterson and removing pronouns. Okay, where am I? I think I may end up skipping over a few things. All right, so I'm just going to jump in here. Brandon Young writes, James Joyce influenced so many philosophers. I have to admit, I'm a Philistine. I don't enjoy Joyce. I tried reading Ulysses for a bit, and I was like, and everybody had talked it up so much, and I was like, what the hell am I doing this for? I could be reading some other stuff instead. And I have a similar take on a good portion of modernist literature, so I'm a bad person to talk about that sort of thing. William Price asks, wondering what the status of Hour Hegel is. We were studying the phenomenology in a private group and are almost caught up to the end of your YouTube lectures there. Truly appreciated. Thanks. Well, that's amazing, because that's a lot of lectures. And that's a huge investment of time. I am approaching lecture 200, which I'm hoping to shoot later tonight. Actually, 199 and 200 tonight. Now, on the public stuff, you don't actually see it. I think it's about lecture 185 or 186 at this point, but that's because my Patreon supporters of the Hour Hegel project get to see the videos a little bit in advance of everybody else. So where are we? I don't have my book with me, but we're about, I would say we're close to 60% done with the book. We're in the middle of the spirit section. We're in the second portion of spirit, which is very cool. I never thought I would get this far. It's taking me quite a bit longer than I originally anticipated. It's a ton of work, but it's very rewarding. It's not getting that much traction in terms of people who would write about digital humanities, or that sort of stuff, which I'm a little disappointed in. But I think we just have to do some more outreach in that respect. But anybody who likes the Half Hour Hegel project, you should send in things to people and like the Chronicle of Higher Ed, or New York Times, and say, hey, there's this thing going on, you guys should write about it. And there's maybe like a 1% chance that they will, but it's sort of like shooting with a shotgun. Some of those pellets are bound to hit somewhere. Yeah, it's a cool project. I'm already getting a lot of inquiries about what I'll do after that, and I'm engaging in some discussion with some of the people who've been big fans and supporters for a long time about what would make sense to do next. I probably will tackle another big, thick book, and I'm not sure which one it will be after that. Let's skip down. A lot of discussion of Jordan Peterson. He seems to be quite the topical guy. Brandon Young writes another interesting thing. When I was a graduate student, almost no one was doing a thesis in Heidegger. It was frowned upon very much so. Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. When we talk about the world of philosophy, America, we got to remember that there's all these different philosophy programs, and each one is its own animal, right? They may be rather enamored of whatever the big elite universities are doing and feel like they need to catch up to them, but a lot of them are also doing their own thing, and they're their own ecosystem, you could say. So that's good to keep in mind. I think we skipped up a little bit here. All right. I want to wrap up pretty soon because we're almost at the top of the hour where I need to call somebody. So I'm going to try to grab a few very short things I can respond to. Paul Steers. Hi, Greg. I know this is off topic, but I know you're a fan. Thoughts on the new Game of Thrones season? I think it's too short. I don't think 7 or 8 episodes is enough to satisfactorily wrap things up. But otherwise, it's pretty good. So all the chips are falling, and there probably won't be many people left over by the end. Let's see. There's a lot of people weighing in back and forth about continental and analytic philosophy. All right, I'll weigh in on 2 other questions, and then I'm going to get off very quickly. This is from Francis Persona. What do I think of Zizek's contributions to a contemporary re-understanding of Hegel? I think that Zizek is really doing more Zizek inspired by Hegel than anything that's strictly speaking Hegel. But then again, anybody's free to do that sort of thing if they want to. And Hegel was wrong about some stuff, like the end of history. So I think I don't always follow exactly what Zizek is talking about, and sometimes when I do follow it, I'm like, well, I don't think that's right at all. I'm glad he's out there bringing attention to Hegel, stuff that he puts out, but it's so much of an investment to just keep up with him. So last one I'll take. Where was that now? Shibboleth. Heidegger stole a lot from Kierkegaard and never admitted it. I don't know. I'd have to dig back through there. I wouldn't say he stole from Kierkegaard. It's A-OK in philosophy to appropriate other people's concepts, and work through them. I know that, certainly Jaspers and Marcel, who are contemporaries of Heidegger, were drawing, well, Ortega y Gasset, not Ortega y Gasset, Unamuno, were drawing heavily on Kierkegaard at the time. I don't know. That one I'd have to think more about, and what exactly counts as stealing in this case. So, right. So I am going to wrap it up here and say thanks to everybody. Next time, I'll make sure that I get to see the questions as they're popping up. Thanks for everybody for joining me, and have a great day.